Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hi everyone, and welcome to On the House, the Household Management Science Insights podcast, produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element, with expert knowledge from professionals in the field. I'm your host, Gabriella Joustra, coming to you from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's get started. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today we're going to be talking about growing indoor plants successfully with Madison Moulton, who is a writer and editor in the gardening industry. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm going good today. So before we get going, did you want to introduce yourself a little bit more so everyone can get to know you?
Sure. Well, I first want to say thanks for having me on. Like you said, my name is Madison. I'm a writer, editor, photographer in the gardening industry. I spend most of my day researching trends and writing about them for magazines and digital publications, and just generally teaching people how to take care of their plants.
That's great. I definitely need help there, so can't wait to get into this episode. But before we do, we're going to do a section called Have You Met Madison?
Great.
So what's your favorite book?
Favorite book is very tough. There's definitely a lot, but one that I've read recently that I enjoyed is called Chaos Machine. Quite a dramatic title. It's by Max Busher, and it's about social media and sort of how social media companies have influence the world and change things. I'm super interested in the topic because I'm not really on social media a lot. And yeah, it was just very well researched and super interesting.
I've noticed my own habits have changed with social media, and I think it's changed a lot of how our society works in some ways. So that'd be an interesting book to read.
Yeah, I think lots of people's habits are sort of changing when they realize how much it influences your daily life. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there a movie that you've enjoyed recently?
Recently, I struggle with movies. I'm one of those people that likes to rewatch things 1,000 times before I watch anything new. But I recently watched The Menu with Ralph Fiennes. And it was just something that I've never seen before. It was really well done and super interesting. So yeah, I really enjoyed that one.
Yeah, what's that about again?
It's very dramatic, but no spoilers for anyone in case anyone wants to watch it. But it's basically about a bunch of rich people that go to this very fancy restaurant on an island, and the chef. He has some ideas about how to run his restaurant, and it sort of devolves into chaos. But yeah, I don't want to spoil it because it is a great movie for anyone who wants to watch it.
Okay, I'll have to watch that. My partner watched it and said I should watch it.
Definitely worth it.
Are you listening to any podcasts at the moment?
For some reason, I gravitate towards podcasts about books. I don't know why. But my favorite podcast at the moment is actually an Australian podcast called Book Cheat. Dave Warnicky is the host, and he reads classic books that you would sort of read in school or that we're all supposed to have read, and goes through the whole story with different comedians. And they just sort of talk about the book and the context around it. So that's definitely one of my favorites. There's also a recent one called If Books Could Kill that I'm loving. I've already listened to all the episodes. There's only a few. But he goes through popular books that have sold like millions of copies and basically breaks down why the claims in them are sort of dubious and why their influences on society are questionable, that kind of thing.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think I've heard of the second podcast you mentioned, and it is on my to listen list. But yeah, it's so long. But yeah, you must be really
Yeah.
into books to listen to so many books about podcasts about books.
Yeah, I don't know why it started. I think I tried to get into audiobooks and I struggled there. So I thought that's when I found BookCheat. I thought if I'm listening to a podcast about books, I can sort of learn about them at the same time. And yeah, I just loved it so much. One of the hosts of If Books Could Kill also has a podcast called Maintenance Phase. That's another super popular one that I'm very interested in. But yeah, mostly the book-related podcasts are up my alley.
Yeah. Yes. Do you have a role model?
Role model is a bit of a tricky question because obviously the people that have the biggest influence on my life are sort of my family and friends, and that influence me the most. But in terms of my career and what I do every day, there's a lot of people that inspire me. In Cape Town specifically, there's a flower farmer called the Dean, who is, she's just expanded her whole farm to include peonies. She grows the most stunning dahlias, and there's just a whole list of flowers that I would love to grow. Cut flower gardening is huge at the moment, and I've mainly only grown houseplants because I haven't had the space. Now that I do have some extra space, there's so many cut flower farmers around the world that inspire me. So my Instagram is full of flowers at the moment, and that's sort of my New Year's resolution for the year.
What is cut flower farming?
It's basically like you think of traditional farming where you grow food and you harvest them. So cut flower farming is just growing flowering plants to harvest them. Some people sell them, some people dry them, other people just grow them in their own homes for like use in their house. But it's sort of a large scale growing flowers rather than just a traditional flower garden.
Okay. So how do you define household management?
Household management, I guess, is sort of how you structure and build habits around your daily life at home. I spend a lot of my time at home because I work from home, and I see how much of an impact household management has on my perception of the space, how I feel about my day. So yeah, I think it's just really important to sort of have a routine and structure for your home that makes it feel like a calming and good place to be.
And what are some misconceptions about it?
I guess I see a lot of when I've been looking at sort of household management that like it's hard work or that it's a lot of effort. But when you build these sort of routines, I found that it actually makes my day easier, makes me feel better, improves my mood. So it doesn't have to be this sort of like annoying chore that you have to do. I see it as more of like a positive way to structure things that makes things less complicated rather than more complicated.
Yeah, I think if you've got the right system in your house, then it should be easier rather than harder.
Yeah.
So what is the difference between like indoor plants and outdoor plants?
Well, indoor plants, I suppose indoor plants as a definition don't really exist because plants come from outside. But indoor plants, the way we describe them, are just plants that are happy to grow indoors. So they're usually happy to grow in containers. They're relatively compact plants. You won't find giant trees growing indoors. Most of them are also from the tropics because they like warm temperatures and our homes are warm. They like high humidity, things like that. And most importantly, they're able to handle lower light than usual, which is why a lot of the things we classify as indoor plants are actually just shade plants when you grow them outdoors. But yeah, technically no indoor plant really exists. It's just things that we've grown or are able to grow indoors.
So I guess why do people Why do people do this? Why do we take these outside plants inside?
Well, the reason I started was I live in quite a green area. And when I moved away from home to go to university, I moved to a city where there's not a lot of plants. My home didn't have any greenery in it. So my first motivation was just, I need nature around me. And the only space I had to grow was indoors. I think that's true for a lot of people nowadays. And they do provide so many benefits. Just having like a single plant, besides the aesthetic value, I just found that it makes the space feel lighter and cleaner, and brings you closer to nature, especially if you don't really have access to any of that in your own home.
And what are some challenges that people have with indoor plants?
The biggest challenge most people talk to me about is just killing their plants. Whenever I say that I'm in the gardening industry and I grow houseplants primarily, their first response is always, oh, I can't do that. I kill all of the plants that I try to grow. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the challenges revolve around taking too much care of them, which is sort of an oxymoron, I suppose, or not taking enough care of them. But just generally, the biggest challenge, I think, is trying to keep the plants alive and looking as good as the day you bought them.
So you said that people take too much care of a plant.
Yes.
What does that look like? Are you petting the leaves every day like a pet? That's what I do.
Mostly it's the general fussing does have an impact on plants. They generally like to be left alone. But sort of interacting with them daily is not a big issue. It's more of the worrying about whether they're getting enough water. So if they start to dry out, you instantly rush to water them when they don't actually need it. Or constantly moving plants around because you're worried about whether they're in the right conditions. But plants generally like to be left alone. Growing indoors is already not natural for them. So once you put them in a spot, it's best to just sort of leave them alone, enjoy them from afar, and follow a few basic care tips rather than sort of messing with them every day. Repotting is another common one that people, I think, worry about a lot. Does my plant have enough space? But the more you repot them and the more you mess with the roots and the leaves, the more stress they'll get. So too much care is just sort of the extra fussing that some people do that's really not necessary and ends up doing more damage than good.
So you mentioned repotting. So I did have a plant that was growing really, really well, and then it grew too big and it started dying. So I repotted it and it's done really well. So how do you know when is a good time and when is a bad time to repot?
It depends on sort of the performance of the plant.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people will want to repot as soon as they bring it home, which in some cases does work and in some cases doesn't. It's normally best to look out for a few signs that they've sort of outgrown their space. Most indoor plants don't mind being confined to containers, especially for flowering plants. The extra sort of stress there can actually encourage them to flower and produce more leaves and grow better. But once the roots are really wrapped around each other and they have no more space to go, that's when it's time to repot. So they might start growing through the drainage holes at the bottom. The leaves might turn yellow. Also, if there's less soil, it holds on to less moisture, so the pots start drying out really quickly. And that's normally a sign that your plant needs just a little bit more extra space to grow and to allow you to untangle those roots that are wrapped around each other.
And when you do get around to repotting them, like, are there any tips that you have to doing that?
I think my biggest tip is do it outside, because I've repotted indoors so many times and it's always a disaster to clean up. Mm-hmm. There's also, I see a lot of people that just lay newspaper down. But in terms of plant health, the biggest tip I would have is to do it quickly. Roots don't really like being disturbed or exposed to the air, so they would prefer more time in the soil than out of it. The sooner you repot, so it's a case where, like, if you've taken the plant out of the pot, don't leave it there and go have a coffee while you're waiting to put it back. Yeah, transfer from the one to the other, water straight away so that it gets settled in, and that will limit your chances of transplant shock.
Okay. That's good to know, because I have also tried to repot some other plants and they have not done so well.
Yeah, it's also, if they stress, and repotting adds to the stress, sometimes it is necessary. If they stress because they need to be repotted, there's nothing you can do about it. But as long as they have the right care, and again, if you don't fuss over them once you've repotted, then after a few weeks they do sort of go back to normal.
Okay, that's good to know. What about pets? Are pets problems for plants?
Yes. It depends on what you want to grow. There's some pet-friendly house plants. One of my favorites is the spider plant, a chlorophytum, because it looks great. It's very easy to grow, and pets are no problem. I find I have a lot of older dogs. They're all over 10. They don't even take a second look at the plants. But it's when you have puppies or cats especially like to sort of interact with the plants, and a lot of them are quite dangerous. Especially a lot of the aroids contain calcium oxalate crystals, which if ingested can cause a lot of problems. Cut flowers are also issues. There was actually a case in Cape Town a few weeks ago where one of their cats was hospitalized from lilies. And it's just like basic interaction with, they can brush past it. So if you do have curious pets, it's best to sort of do some research on what plants can be dangerous and which ones aren't dangerous, to grow those or keep them very far out of reach to avoid any problems.
Yeah, my cat was for a while destroying the plants that I think to get our attention. So we moved the spider plant into his reach because we knew at least that one wasn't going to hurt him. Yeah. And then he ate a bit of that one, did not like it.
Yeah, so, I also find keeping them out of reach stops them from knocking anything over, and cleaning up soil is never fun. So
yes,
that's also a helpful part of it.
Eventually, I just moved them onto a different shelf so the cat couldn't get to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was much easier. What are some other common problems that people have with their plants?
I think that the biggest problems are in sort of like the basic care elements and not understanding how they relate to their houseplants. There's a lot of simplified advice on the internet, which is always well-meaning. But things like if you have infographics where there's watering advice and it's just 3 little dots for how much you need to water, doesn't really explain how it impacts your plants at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. So in like things like watering are super important. Light levels are super important. And I think people can often get mixed up in the simplified explanations of all these things. When those can end up being the biggest plant killers, like overwatering, because it can be so dangerous if it leads to root rot, is one of the biggest houseplant killers. And many people don't know that watering too often can kill your plants. So I think the challenges sort of relate to understanding how these aspects of care have an impact and how they damage your plants, diagnosing any problems that may arise so that you can bring your plants back to good health.
So I guess how do you decide, or how do you know how much to water your plants?
The first thing is research. There's when you've worked with houseplants for many, many years, it's relatively easy to tell. It does get easier. But when you're first starting out, knowing where a plant comes from has a big influence. Although succulents are not really indoor plants, you definitely don't want to give succulents the same amount of water as you would a peace lily, for example. So knowing what they need from their native environments is important. And then once you sort of understand the moisture levels that are required, I always recommend testing the soil every few days, just with your finger, moving it around to see how much moisture is still in the container. I think a lot of people find it easier to sort of set a reminder on your phone once a week and then water then. But because environment has such a big impact on the moisture levels in the pots, changes in temperature, changes in light levels can all impact how much moisture remains in the soil. If you water on a schedule, you sort of ignore all of those conditions, which can lead to overwatering or underwatering at some point. So I always just test the soil every couple of days, and then that lets me know the perfect time to water based on the actual moisture in the container rather than a strict schedule.
So you mentioned as well that people should research to find out what the conditions are for those specific plants.
Yeah.
But I've been in the position where my dad has handed me a plant and said, Here you go. And then I send a picture of it to him and I say, Dad, what's this? What's the name of this plant? And he goes, oh, it's Fred. And I'm like, thanks, Dad. So I don't know anything about this plant except that it's green and it has leaves. So how do I know what it's called so I can look it up and find out how to care for it?
If it's like a sort of traditional indoor plant, a lot of them are easy to recognize if you sort of look for lists of common indoor plants. But obviously not all are related. It might not even be able to grow, or it might not even be a common indoor plant. So there's a lot of apps that I've also used. I love using them when I'm like on hikes to find the names of interesting plants. The results are questionable sometimes, but if it's sort of a common plant that a lot of people have tried to identify, it normally is quite accurate in picking those things up. I think the one I used is called Plant Scanner. I'm not sure. I haven't used it in a while. But as long as you take sort of a clear picture, then they're relatively good at identifying what plant it is. Otherwise, I would say find someone you know that knows about plants and ask them.
And hope they're not like my dad, who was not used at all.
Yes, I also give my plants many colorful names. So I do. I'm someone who would name their plants Fred too.
I don't name my plants interesting plants. My jade plant is called Jade. My pearl plant is called
Makes sense.
Pearl. It's very easy. What about so our water has chemicals in it like chlorine and things. Is that a problem for the plants?
Generally, yes. It depends on the quality of your tap water. It's mainly a problem that affects people in very dense cities where there's a lot of chemicals added. And again, some plants are more tolerant of it than others. But when you continually water with tap water, the chemicals can build up in the soil. They hold on to minerals and nutrients, and that can lead to problems in the roots later on. It's similar to over-fertilizing, where if you add too much fertilizer and there's too many chemicals around the roots, it can actually burn them. With tap water, it does take quite a while, but over time, you'll sort of start to see your plants looking a bit sad and not as healthy as they could be. It's tricky. It's recommended to use sort of filtered water or distilled water, but obviously that's, if you have a lot of plants, that's a bit difficult. So I always recommend, if you have a way to just collecting rainwater, it's the same water that they receive outdoors in their native habitats, and then you don't have to spend money on filtered water or anything complicated. Otherwise, you can water with tap water and then flush the soil around once or twice a month with filtered water to try and get rid of some of those chemicals, and then you can keep watering with tap water.
Okay. So another method I've been told to use for watering my plants is to put them in the sink
Yes.
and fill up the sink rather than like tipping the water into the pot. What's the best way to water them?
Bottom watering is a great way to water plants if it's done correctly. There's also a lot of risks involved. So depending on how dry the soil is, it will absorb as much moisture as needed from the water, and then you can take the plants out. But problems come in where people leave them in the sink for an entire day or sort of forget about them, which can lead to problems with overwatering and root rot because they don't like to sit in water. The other issue is that if you are using tap water or if you have over-fertilized by accident, watering from the bottom doesn't flush any of those chemicals out of the soil. So what I do with my plants, because I have so many, is I grab them all, stick them in the bath, leave them in the water for half an hour to 45 minutes. And then before I take them out, I just rinse over the top, also to get that top layer of soil moist, which normally doesn't happen when you water from the bottom. And then I can be sure that it's evenly moist all around, which sometimes doesn't happen when you water from the top.
So how often do you do that?
It depends on the conditions, the temperature. I live in an area with very high humidity. It's up to 90% sometimes. So it doesn't happen very often. I would say probably once every 2 weeks or so. And then if there is a specific plant, obviously they're all in very different containers. So for those in very small containers where the soil dries out very quickly, I'll water those more often. But the general large-scale watering happens about every 2 weeks or so.
Okay. I'm just loving this idea of having all of your plants together in the bath and then giving them all a shower. It's very cute.
It honestly looks like a tropical jungle, especially because I have some tall ones. And then the water drips down onto the other. It's just like it creates a very calming, relaxing feeling when I do it.
Oh, that sounds so lovely. So between the different seasons, so you mentioned before that humidity and like how hot it is can change everything. So I'm guessing as well, between winter and summer, there's like a big difference in how you care for your plants. I guess, what are some differences there?
The main reason that there's differences between the season is because the plants sort of slow growth. Some people say they become dormant, but for most plants, that's not completely true. It's just not their active growing season because the temperatures have dropped and they slow growth when it's cold. So when growth is slower, they'll absorb less water for photosynthesis, which means there's more water in the soil available. You don't need to water as often. You don't really need to fertilize because they're not growing a lot. They don't need those nutrients. So fertilizing too much over autumn and winter can lead to over-fertilizing. And generally, because growth is slow, you wouldn't do things like heavy pruning or repotting because it'll take them a bit longer to recover. It's best to do any of those care things in early spring when they're about to kick off growth, just so that they can recover as quickly as possible.
You mentioned also, so fertilizing. How often should we be doing that? Because I don't fertilize my plants ever.
And a lot of people don't fertilize. I'm also definitely guilty of that just because it's an extra step that it's like, oh, do I really have to do this? But it is quite important for older houseplants that you've had for quite a while. Growers and nurseries pack pots with fertilizer to make them look good for selling. So generally, you don't need to fertilize when you've brought it home. They should be happy for quite a while. I've had plants that I haven't fertilized for a year or so, and they still look fine. But eventually, because they're in that container, they're going to run out of nutrients if you don't repot and give them new soil, which is where fertilizer comes in. The speed of growth will influence how often you need to fertilize. If your plant's growing really quickly, if it's in great conditions, it's going to use up more of those nutrients. Whereas if it's in a lower light area where it's sort of just surviving and not really growing as much, you don't need to fertilize as often. But generally it's every 4 to 6 weeks or so, only in spring and summer, with liquid fertilizers. I normally use a half dose because full strength fertilizers can sometimes cause more damage than good, depending on the product you're using. But they all have different ratios and concentrations. So the most important thing is to just read the instructions on the packaging. And then I normally halve that just to sort of see how it goes. If the plants look like they could do with more fertilizer, then I'll use the full dose.
Okay. Yeah, I probably should get some fertilizer for my plants. I think that might be why one of my oldest ones has died recently.
Yeah. It's
It
very
just gave
helpful,
up.
especially if your plants might look like they're surviving, but you don't know how good they could be growing if they have the right nutrients. So it's also fun after fertilizing to watch them put out new leaves or flowers, because they do have everything they need rather than just the bare minimum.
Okay. Maybe I'll do a video documentary of my plants before and after.
Yeah, I love those like time lapse videos. So I mean, it would be a long time lapse, but it would be very interesting.
So my dad used to bring plants inside in winter. Would you recommend doing that? So he does some outside plants, like a lemon tree, and then bring them inside.
Yes.
That's a good idea.
It depends on the climate that you live in. There's sort of debate about it because you don't, like I said, plants don't like changes in conditions. So you don't really want to move them to a completely different environment. But if you live in a climate where temperatures drop below what the plants need, then you have to bring them indoors or they'll die. Most tropical plants will face a lot of cold damage and may not recover the following season. It causes a lot of stress. So people just bring them indoors to protect them. You can also use things like frost covers, but the general temperature is still cold, so it's not great for them. But as long as when you bring them indoors, you give them very similar conditions. So if they were in full sun, like a lemon tree should be, they need to be in front of a very bright window just to sort of make up for the changes in conditions that they would have moving between the two spaces.
And would you put them like near a heater, or should plants be anywhere near a heater or very far away from a heater?
Usually very far, especially I have those fan heaters, which are terrible because they use so much power. But the changes in conditions from that heater actually causes more problems. It's also the same reason you shouldn't leave your plants in front of an open window if you have like a lot of air flowing through. They like airflow, but not too much because it rapidly changes the environment around the plants. So putting them next to a heater, especially ones that are very hot, will probably kill them very quickly. If you have a heater that sort of generally heats up a room, that's not terrible, as long as it stays that temperature consistently, rather than switching it on and off and temperatures go up and down, which will cause them more stress.
Okay, so like I guess evenly heated room is better than one that gets cold and then gets hot and then gets cold.
Yes, very much so, yeah.
So it's a bit like me. Does humidity have a role when it comes to growing plants?
Very much so, but it also depends on the plants you want to grow. Most indoor plants are tropical. They come from rainforests where humidity is at minimum above 75%. And whenever you're growing plants, you want to try and match the conditions in their native habitats as much as you can. So for most house plants, especially the common ones like monsteras, they need relatively high humidity. Aim for about 60%, but above 40% is normally okay. If you have very dry air inside your home, which some people do, they really struggle to grow tropical plants successfully. I always recommend using a humidifier. it just sort of gives them those conditions, and it doesn't have to be a general like massive thing. I have a small humidifier that I keep just in a cabinet with some of the plants that like really high humidity, just to give them the conditions that they prefer, and to stop them from drying out. One of the signs of low humidity is if the tips of the leaves turn brown, which can be caused by a few other things. But if you have very low humidity, especially in a season where it's not very rainy, then that is a sign that they probably need a humidifier or some extra humidity.
That's a great tip, because I think that happened to my plant. Actually, I think everything bad has happened to my plants.
Yeah, I mean, even with the research that I've done, with the amounts of plants that I've cared for, I still kill a bunch of plants. It's just what happens. But the more plants you grow, and terribly, the more plants you kill, the more you learn from your mistakes.
Yep. Do plants have like a limited lifespan?
It's an interesting question, because, when we think of trees, they say this tree lives 20 years and then it dies off. With houseplants, it's tricky to say. I think most houseplants die before their expected lifespan because of something we've done wrong, or because of conditions and care, those related things. But there's also, if you think of African violets, how popular these plants are, and they are coveted and passed down from generation to generation. As long as they're in the right conditions, they should theoretically live forever, or not forever, but like they should live for a very long time, if they're happy where they are. Most houseplants don't live that long, because eventually something goes wrong, but that is sort of how it works. Also, when they're grown in containers, it's not a natural place for them. They normally won't live as long as expected if they were planted outdoors in the perfect environment.
So it's kind of like the opposite of pets, because pets live longer because they're inside.
Yeah.
But plants live not as long. Oh,
yeah, unfortunately.
So what's a practice that you do to sort of keep your own plants healthy?
And usually, it doesn't happen every day. Life gets in the way sometimes. But what I like to do is sort of just walk around and check on the plants. It doesn't mean I'll necessarily do everything that day. But in the morning, sort of taking a look at them, checking the soil just to see if there's any problems. It also allows you to pick up issues a lot quicker. So if you spot a leaf that's turning yellow or a pest problem, you can deal with it straight away. And it'll help you decide the perfect time to water. So not necessarily actively doing something every day, but because I have so many plants, I need to keep an eye on them and know how they're doing every day. So I just sort of walk around, with the morning coffee, check on them and make sure everything's looking good.
And how do you think that how do you think plants impact your home?
Oh, there's tons of impacts. First of all, it just looks better. I love the look of plants. Obviously, houseplants have grown in popularity in recent years. And I think one of the reasons for that is they just are a great decor element. We don't want to treat them as inanimate decor because they are living things, but I think they do just brighten a space and bring nature that you might not have around you outdoors, indoors, to sort of bring that connection in. But also there's a whole bunch of studies proving that they improve your mood. I have a few in my office because they're also proven to improve productivity. There's tons of benefits, aesthetic and sort of personal. And the act of caring for them is also, it provides a lot of satisfaction. It's a calming activity and just sort of connects you with nature inside your own home.
That's lovely. And yeah, I really do love having my plants. I talk to them sometimes, weeks to see how they're going.
Yeah.
Is there anything that we've missed that you wanted to discuss?
I think if any of this sounds sort of overwhelming, I thought I would recommend a couple of sort of beginner-friendly plants that people can start with if it sounds a bit too much. So the first one would be a ZZ plant. It's a very, very tough plant. I have a couple that I've sort of forgotten about. Definitely guilty of leaving a plant there and then sort of wondering what's happened to it. But I have never killed one. It's always survived no matter what conditions I put them in. Obviously, there are optimal conditions for them to grow better. But as of yet, I've had for 3 or 4 years and I have not killed them yet. Another one is a pothos, which is quite popular for hanging baskets or trailing down shelves. You can also train them up a wall or something like that. And they're also pretty much impossible to kill. Even though their leaves are relatively thin, they are very drought tolerant. They can handle, if you forget to water, it's not a problem, and they grow very quickly. They're also great to propagate. So if you want extra plants, you can do that. But those two are not very pet friendly. So if you do have pets, then I would recommend the spider plant. It's another one that's easy to propagate, looks good in hanging baskets, and they can grow quite big or you can keep them small. So it's good for any sort of indoor space.
I actually got a spider plant from my neighbor during a windstorm. One of them blew off. Withered on the ground. There was a little tiny bit of green left on it. I decided, I'll just pop it in some soil, see what happens. Great. It's flourishing.
Yeah, they grow rapidly. And the little pups that they produce, they're so easy to root. You just pop them in a glass of water and they produce roots within like a week. So you can have a house full of spider plants within 2 years or so if they're growing well.
Yeah, my ones are now having little pups everywhere, and I'm like, do I want to have more? How many is too many?
To have more plants. Or I like to just share them with people. You know, I propagate my monsteras every 2 months or so. And I think I've definitely hit capacity at this point, even though they're my favorite house plants. So I like to just sort of hand them out to people who might need them. It's always good to share the fruits of your labor.
And it looks like you spent a lot of money on it, because they can be quite expensive sometimes. Yeah,
they make great birthday gifts. You don't have to mention that you've propagated it. It can just be put in a nice pot.
Exactly. So we've also got some questions from the audience.
Yes.
So our first one is, so the signs of overwatering and underwatering are similar. How can we tell the difference?
It's very difficult. I've also seen a lot of things online of people complaining about these articles that say, when you have yellow leaves, it could be overwatering or it could be underwatering. You could be fertilizing too little or you could be fertilizing too much. So it's very much down to analyzing your own care routine. With overwatering, a lot of the time, if the problem is so bad that it's visible in the leaves, the soil will stay moist because the roots aren't drawing up any moisture. And if it's underwatering, the soil will be very dry. It gets compacted. The soil also sort of draws away from the sides of the pot. So it's normally easy to tell that way. But if it's sort of 50-50, it's best to analyze your own care routine and think, have I watered it when it didn't need it? Did I forget to water? And from that, sort of decide which of the two is more likely.
Okay, that's great, because that's definitely something that I have experienced where I thought I was watering it fine and it was actually too much. Luckily, again, my dad was able to diagnose it for me.
Yeah, it is a very common issue, but unfortunately, all signs are very similar. I think there's probably more than 10 causes of yellowing leaves on a lot of houseplants. So actually tracking down what the issue is hard detective work.
What about signs for a healthy plant?
It depends on the season, but in spring and summer, normally new growth is always a good sign. Roots are always expanding to support more growth above the soil. So any new leaf is always a great sign, very exciting. Also, color is a big indicator. For example, low light can impact the color of your plants. So when they're healthy and happy, they'll normally be a healthy green. Otherwise, they sort of lose their color a bit. And generally they look good normally when you buy them. If they keep looking good, that's a good sign. But if you notice any leaves dropping, changing color, or any like pest and disease signs, then that's normally a sign that there's an issue.
So our third question is, how do we know that the plants are getting enough sunlight?
Normally new growth is the best sign if they look happy. A lot of the time with indoor plants, they're not getting enough light. A lot of spaces just don't have the right amount of sun indoors. And people underestimate the amount of light that they actually have. For example, today is a very cloudy day. The light levels, even right in front of a window, are not going to be enough for the plants. But new growth is generally a good sign. If they don't show any signs of struggle, and if the soil continually dries out before you water again, then that's a sign they are getting enough light. If they aren't getting enough light, they'll probably stretch towards the closest light source. They might start wilting or drooping because they don't have enough energy. They obviously won't put out any new leaves or new growth if they aren't getting enough sunlight.
This reminds me of a plant that I have, which I propagated and I gave to my mum. And she has us in a very dark area. Yeah. So the leaves of her plant are very dark, but it's also really big, this plant. The ones that I have, possibly because I keep propagating them and splitting them, but they're very light, the leaves. I guess what's good for it? How much light? I mean, I guess it's hard because you don't know which plant it is, but what is this a sign of?
Generally, most plants would prefer bright, indirect light indoors. So they want to be super, super close to a window, but just not in the path of direct sun, because that can also burn the leaves. This is the closest match to what most of the plants would receive outdoors. But if you're growing succulents, for example, then they need to be right in front of that window in the direct sun if you want to keep their shape. When propagating houseplants, quite often, I find it does take them a while to bounce back depending on the conditions they're in. So they won't look as full as usual. Also, when you get a plant from a nursery, often it's quite overcrowded already. So they look a lot more abundant than they normally would. But over time, I think the longer we have houseplants, because the conditions are always not quite perfect, they're always going to look not as great as they used to, even if they are happy and even if they have great care. It's just not the right environment for them to like really perform. So they'll always look a little bit diminished. But as long as they're healthy and there's no problems, then it's fine.
Yeah, that's all of our questions today from the audience.
Great.
That was, thank you for coming on the show. If our listeners want to find out more about you, how can they learn about you?
My website is madisonmoulton.com, which has some of my work, but most of my plant-related stuff now goes on Instagram, which is also where I'll be starting my cut flower journey, and that's at With Love in Spades. Other than that, my articles are sort of spread over the internet, so if you're doing some plant research, you may see a few of them pop up every now and then.
That's so nice. Yeah, it'll be a surprise for us. So we'll put some of those links that you mentioned into the show notes so people can find that easily.
Great.
Thank you for joining me today. It was really lovely to chat with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to On the House, produced by the Household Management Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes like this from across 10 life management perspectives can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, and any other podcasting apps available on your smart devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating, sharing, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people to find it so we can grow and continue to bring you quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website, hm.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Gabriella Joustra. Thanks for tuning in.